Wort cooling. Yeah, right.
All right.
So cool. This is where your hot block stops. So this is where you need to be extra careful on sanitation procedures, cleaning, and sanitizing. So the idea now is to we've done the work for the yeast. Like it's pretty much where the brewer's job ends, and we hand it over to the yeast to keep the process. So we've done our work of extracting the sugar, putting all of the solid parts away, giving it some bitterness and aromas. It's pretty much all ready to ferment, but it's still too hot. Like it's still about 95 degrees or something like that, and you really want to cool it down. So there are different ways of cooling it down, and as we said, pretty fast because you've added some hops that will keep will keep giving bitterness along the way. So there are different ways there. What you see on the picture is a coil that is just actually one pipe that goes into the kettle, goes around to increase the surface area, the contact area, and then goes back down, back down the kettle, back out of the kettle, and then the idea is to circulate cold water into that coil so that it will take the heat out of the hot wort, and will so there will be cold water getting in, it will get heating up, and then there will be hot water getting out, and this is how you take the calories out of your wort. That's one way of doing. I don't usually work with that one, but it works really fine.
Yeah, for that one, I would add, if you go back, Xavi, for the coil, I would say that the more curves you have, the faster you will chill the wort, and the cooler the water that you are running through it is, the faster you will do it. I used to use one of those, and the one tip that I can say to you, if you want to be extra careful about the sanitation of the coil, because you are already entering in the cold stage, you can already put the coil inside the boil kettle when you are like 5 to 10 minutes to the end of the boil. So you're pretty sure the coil is pasteurized and there's no living bacteria on it. But again, always make sure in advance that it's clean enough to put in your beer so you don't impact any flavors. But it's a good tip to pasteurize it.
Yeah, all of the cooling methods are a little bit of the same principle. It's about maximizing the heat exchange surfaces, and those things that you see on the screen are also very good, and they're called plate heat exchangers. And then and in the principle they work a little bit of the same as the coil. So you're circulating wort on one end and wort on the other end, and they kind of cross flow without contact, and you can get the calories out of the hot liquid very easily. In this case, you need to run the wort through the heat exchanger as you run the wort as well. So the coil you use it in the kettle, then you transfer the heat exchanger you use while you're transferring, if that makes sense. But these are very good. They're very nice. They work really nice. They are just a little bit harder to clean, so they're a big contamination potential. If you don't have any of those, there are still ways of doing it. You probably have a bathtub at home, and you can fill them with cold water, bring some ice into there, and you leave it there. It should cool down over time. I would just suggest that you cover it so you don't have anything going into your wort before you send it over to fermentation. And also, it's something at some point we need to. Yeah, at this point you also want to check the gravity of your wort. I don't know if it is the next slide.
It is coming a little bit later.
Okay. We'll talk about it later then.
It is coming actually just later. Before we move on to this step, I have just one question on cooling from Niels Periens, who's asking if the whirlpool, I think to go back to what David was saying, does the whirlpool still work with a cooling coil in the kettle?
Yes, it does. Just give it a nice vortex.
Yeah, I think it will. There are ways to make it work. I think it will interact a little bit, but it should work.
Okay, let's move on to the next step then, which is the gravity.
Okay, gravity, cool. Yeah, but this is exactly where you want to know. I mean, there are ways to control if everything is going well, but is it more like the final step? Like, and we will explain it. You need to check gravity of your wort at this point. And gravity basically means how much sugar you've extracted, like how much sugar is there into your wort, and it basically tells you the alcohol potential, because the yeast is gonna go eat up that sugar and turn it into alcohol, basically. So you want to know how much sugar you have to start with, so you want to know, then you kind of know how much alcohol you've produced after fermentation. That's a bit how it works. And it all works, it's based on the density of the liquid. So basically water is the standard and density is 1.000. It's very much influenced by temperature, so make sure you always measure gravity at around 20 degrees C. But then at the
just
end
to add, I mean, sorry, Antoine.
Yeah, go for it.
Just to add, for example, it will be good if you can take a sample towards the end of the boil. So if you are, for example, low on sugars and you are really aiming for a specific target, for example, if you are low, you are still able to boil it for longer, so you have a higher concentration, or you can use sugars to compensate that lack of sugars.
Exactly, but you remember that the temperature is key.
Exactly, yeah. So what you can do, you take a sample, you chill it in a bucket of ice or something like that, a flask inside a bucket of ice, until you reach the 20 degrees, and then you can make your first reading. But of course, the one that interests the most is after the end of the boil, so you can have a prediction for your alcohol.
Yeah, and we give guidelines for the delta as well, so you can assess how close you are from that target. And down the line, it's just linked with how much malt you've used in the beginning. And so to check gravity, you use those hydrometers, they're called, and they're basically plungers that will, depending on the gravity of the liquid, it will plunge further into the liquid or less further in the liquid. And where you're reading the gravity, I think it's pretty obvious on the picture, is so there's a scale on it, and then you look at it where at the level of the liquid, and then you will read the number that appears there and gives you the gravity, basically. And there's some tricks there, because there's a meniscus. You will see that the surface of the liquid is not flat, and there are some curves there, so you really need to read the bottom part of that meniscus, ideally.
Okay, perfect. I think now it's time to do my moderator job.
Yep.
We're now running at 1 hour and 45 minutes, so a nice marathon, guys. I think let's try and keep it as short as we can for the next steps, because I think people will get hungry or thirsty, as I am. Yeah. So anything else to add on gravity? I have no questions on gravity. Anything else to add before we move on to fermentation?
I think gravity, there's different scales, so watch out. There's Plato, and there's specific gravity, but there are converters for these.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
so
we can.
If it's specific gravity, we are aiming for 1053. If it's Plato, we are aiming for 13, and that's what you should aim for.
And it's basically the same thing, just expressed in different units.
Yeah. All right, fermentation. Yay.
All right, fermentation. Let's go.
Yeah, go for it, David. You want me to? Yeah, I don't know.
You can go. I can interact with you.
Okay, fermentation. It's where the yeast works, and that's where when you've started your fermentation, it's about time to open up a beer and get some refreshment if you haven't done it earlier in the process. But basically, it's the yeast that starts working at that stage. And you need one of these things that you see on the picture. These are what basic fermenters. They're plastic fermenters, but they work really well. But you just need a container that is closed with some kind of an airlock on top of it. And basically what you want to do is to create some anaerobic conditions so that there's a oxygen depletion into the tank. so that the yeast can turn its metabolism into fermentation actually, and start producing the alcohol and all of the flavors that comes with it, and actually turn the wort into beer. By doing so, it will just feed on the sugar and transform them into alcohol and carbon dioxide, which is a gas that needs to get out of that tank. And that's why you need those airlock. So you make sure that nothing can come in. So you make sure that the yeast eats up all of the oxygen, and after like 12 hours or something, it will start producing a lot of CO2. And so you make sure that CO2 goes out of your tank, basically.
So if you don't have airlock,
if you don't have an airlock, it will still work because the wort will cover with a layer of CO2. But I think it's a lot safer if you can close it and have an airlock. And if you don't have an airlock at all, there's a chance that your fermenter just explodes, which is, I mean, maybe fun to see, but not fun to clean.
Or you can go wild and just do open fermentation.
Yeah, not for Delta, but yes, you can. Yeah, fermentation temperature is key. I think it's one of the main thing I want to check at this point, right?
Yes. So for this beer we are using Belle Saison, which is a voracious yeast from Lallemand, but you can use something similar from other yeast suppliers. The Belle Saison can ferment really well from, I don't know, 17 degrees to 35 degrees. So it's not usual. Usual temperatures for ale yeast, but is very resistant to high temperatures, and it will perform really well at high temperature. So ideally, when you cool your beer and you put it in the fermenter, you will hydrate the yeast and you will pitch it. And it will ferment. So normally we are aiming for something like 20 degrees to start the fermentation. And for the Delta with the Belle Saison, we'll let it free rise for the maximum as we can. So we are suggesting 28 degrees because it will give nice spiciness, nice earthy flavors, a lot of phenols and a lot of esters. And also will finish drier than if you ferment it at a lower temperature. So there was a bit of some questions about the 28 degrees fermentation, right, Xavi?
Yes, there was a few. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the main reason why we ferment so high, because we still want the Belle Saison to have impact in the beer. We don't want to cover the yeast character from the beer. We want the yeast to shine. So we let it free rise until 28 degrees. But you can go even higher if you want.
Yeah, these temperatures are pretty uncommon for yeast fermentation, beer fermentation, but this kind of yeast actually does behave quite well at those temperatures, and they actually produce more of those flavors, those fermentation flavor, which you actually want. And we've discussed this in the style also. It's that this is what makes for us a Belgian IPA. So it's quite important. If you don't have means of keeping the temperature at 28, I think it's also fine. It will ferment. It will probably produce a little bit less of those estery, phenolic, like spicy aromas.
Yeah, but I'm just giving from my experience, for example, even if you don't have like a room or a chamber at 28 degrees, the Belle Saison, if you give it like 22, 23 degrees, by itself, by the thermic reaction of the fermentation, it will reach super high temperatures. So if you reach them, it's perfect. If not, the yeast will be a bit more shy, but all good. You can also put it in the small room with the electrical heater next to it. Not really next to it, but in the same chamber. It's just some tips.
And about pitching, you can pitch the yeast dry, or you can have a starter, or you can rehydrate it. But I would definitely suggest you to read the supplier's guidelines for that, and make sure you remain sterile, because this is a major case of contamination.
Yes, there was a question from both Joel Franca, and that's both his questions actually. he was asking how should we rehydrate the yeast with water? Should we use cool water or lukewarm water?
I think the rehydration step is a risk you take. It definitely makes your fermentation faster, and I think in a way it's good. But if you don't do it properly, there's a potential for disaster. So if you don't know, if you're not sure, if you're not prepared, just go dry yeast straight. I think if you want to rehydrate it, you need to understand a little bit how microorganisms work, and just make sure that your water is microorganisms free. That means you heat it up to pasteurization temperature and then let it cool down, and then you can hydrate your yeast into it. But just be extra careful.
That's how normally people do.
And
so
also,
go for it.
No, also comes back to what I said earlier. Just always think a step ahead, because you might need 3 hours or half an hour to 3 hours to rehydrate your yeast. So you have to do it when you're loitering, actually. So if you think ahead, it's always better.
Perfect. And last question from Chucho from Mexico. He's asking what kind of measurements does he have to do during the fermentation, temperature, pH, gravity, something else?
I would definitely recommend to follow the gravity, because as the fermentation goes, the gravity drops, and you can only make sure your fermentation is done when your gravity stops moving, actually.
Yeah. And so also, if you don't have activity in the beginning, it's good that you take a reading, because perhaps you underpitch yeast, or something is wrong with your yeast. The best before was gone and you didn't notice. So you might need to repitch yeast again, so it's good that you keep a constant track of the gravity performance of the beer.
Yeah, and if you want to avoid problems down the line with the bottle conditioning, I would also suggest that you make sure your fermentation is really done, because otherwise the sugar that haven't fermented in the main fermentation will eventually re-ferment in the bottle, and then you'll have bottles exploding or that kind of stuff. So, so it's a pH is also good to follow if you can, but pH will only tell you if you have some kind of a contamination with lactobacillus or other lactic acid producing bacteria. Yeah. So it's less. I mean, and this kind of thing you will taste it definitely.
Yeah, it's a good topic as well to introduce the concept of diastaticus. So Belle Saison is a diastaticus positive, meaning that if there's sugars that needs to be consumed, she will do it. So it's very important that you give enough time to the fermentation to complete. Otherwise, you will bottle and there's still sugars left that you didn't know, and you might have some bombs.
Yep.
All right. One last question from Joel Franca. He's asking what happens if we let the beer too long in the fermenter. He means if the fermentation process is finished.
It
depends on how much time. Yeah.
Yeah, and the temperature also. If you leave it cold, there's no big risk. If the temperature is a bit higher and it really stays there for we're talking weeks and weeks. There's a risk of what's called autolysis, and it's where the yeast cells starts somehow exploding, but opening up and releasing their inside content into the beer, and that's not good. And the beer will start smelling like drains and like not good. But I would say if it stays like 2, 3, 4 weeks in the tank, it's no issue.
All right, perfect. Then let's move on to dry hopping. Let's bring in some flavor.
Yeah, and I think dry hopping is also a key step in the process. Like most IPAs, like all IPAs actually, introducing hops into the fermented beer or the fermenting beer is also very important in terms of giving a lot of aromas. It's a different kind of process because there the beer is cold and it's with interaction with microorganisms, and the extraction is also, there's a little bit of alcohol into the medium, so there's the extraction is dynamics is a little bit changed. But then this is really where you get the hop forward aroma of the beer. I don't know, David, if you want to give some tips.
No, I mean, dry hopping, I mean, it's like you said, is when you want to give strong aromas of hops to the beer. you just add towards, in the case of the Delta, towards the end of the fermentation. So 9th or 10th, 11th day of fermentation. It really depends of the readings. So for the Delta, we used Cascade, Mosaic, and Citra, but mainly focus on Citra and Cascade and Mosaic just to complement and to play a nice synergy with Citra. Delta used to be a single hop dry hop beer, just Citra, but recently we decided to add Cascade and Mosaic to just give it a nice background and complement the flavors of the or in the aromas of the Citra. Well, but that's it.
I think there's something about quantity. So the dry hopping, how much you put in, and how much is too much, how much is not enough, and it's really depending on taste. I would definitely say that 10 grams per liter is some kind of a limit that you hit when, I mean, you if you put too much, then you have the risk of your beer to be way too fragile and to not survive the bottling and everything. And also, this is where your extraction of essential oils and aromas really starts dropping, so you don't extract that much. So I think Delta is around 5 grams per liter. So I think it's a reasonable amount of hops. It's not extreme. I mean, some brewers are using a lot more hops nowadays, but that would compromise the balance between hop aromas and yeast aromas in this one. And then maybe quickly another concept is the hop creep. Is
yes,
that
we just had a question about this from Anthony Diaz, who's asking if we have any issues with hop creep.
Yeah, but hop creep is something you need to look at. I think 5 grams per liter is not the worst for hop creeping, but definitely when you put hops into your wort or your fermented beer, you also introduce enzymes that have a chance to convert some unfermented sugars into fermentable sugars, and then hence restarting the fermentation a bit. So that's why we suggest to do the dry hopping while the yeast is still a bit active. So it kind of eats up those sugar as it goes. Otherwise, the risk is that you dry hop, you convert those sugar, but the yeast is inactive, and then it re-ferments in the bottle. So key there is to give it time and have active yeast when you're dry hopping.
Okay, perfect.
Just
and
give it extra time to make sure those enzymes will be consumed.
Yep.
All right. Last question before we move on to the next step. From Joel Franca, dry hopping is always with cone, or can we also use pellets?
Both, up to you.
Yes.
Yeah, no,
You decide,
both
Xavi. You
works.
decide, Xavi.
And as Seb said, 1-to-1 ratio is okay.
All right, let's move on to lagering then.
Yeah, lagering is just about it's the final step of fermentation. Basically, it's just dropping down the temperature of the beer. So you can do that by putting it into a fridge or something. Temperature